We shall get started. For those who don't know me, I'm Catherine O'Regan, the Executive Director of Sydney Business Chamber, and welcome to what is another online forum from the Chamber. I should also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land of which I'm on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also would like to thank Moorebank Intermodal, and I think James Balderstone, the CEO, is joining us today, and they're great supporters of the Chamber and our digital partner for this particular forum. Now, the Chamber's been doing a lot of forums in different topics in different ways, but it is fantastic to focus on freight and logistics today. And it's part of our overall forums focusing on city building. And it's been fascinating, I think, for all our experiences during the COVID pandemic. There's been a lot of discussion and change associated with people. And it probably wasn't until some of the things were disappearing on grocery shelves that there was a heightened awareness of the importance of freight to our city. And it was really one of those drivers because of its importance, but its heightened importance during COVID, to have this forum today. And it is a forum which will lead the Chamber into a thought leadership paper on freight and logistics so that we can even further heighten people's understanding of the importance it is to our economy, to our city, and potentially transform some things. But I do have with me a range of leaders and across the whole supply chain when it comes to freight. I have Susie from Transport, thank you. Neil, who comes from a whole city building, logistics, data perspective. So thank you, Neil, for joining us, Neil Templey. And Marika, from the ports perspective, they're likewise an integral part of the whole network within freight. So thank you for joining us. We are doing a hybrid event today, and we have Paul Graham, who manages the supply chain for Woolworths. So thank you, Paul, for likewise coming today. But why don't we start today? I really think it might be a great way to throw to you, Susie, if I may, because you work right across the freight industry. Where's the industry right now? What's the landscape look like?
Yeah, I think, and in preparing for the discussion today, we spoke a little bit about how focused should we be on the performance of the freight industry at the moment, which in terms of, I guess, qualitatively, the performance of the freight industry has been really impressive. In terms of the actual numbers around the movement of goods during COVID, a word that's come up a lot has been lumpiness. And I know we have a number of members from industry on the call today, but there's been a lot of reflection about the only predictability being that things were unpredictable. Mm-hmm. So big dips off in imports, which have sort of come back up again quite steeply in terms of the movement of road transport and rail transport around the network. There have been peaks and troughs that haven't been predictable far in advance, and a lot of that, I guess, has been driven, and Paul might be able to talk more to this, by that consumer demand, which is something we haven't experienced in the past. In the Sydney CBD, from a city perspective, on the data that we have available to us, at its greatest, we saw over a 60% drop in freight servicing at loading docks in the CBD. That had returned to about a 20% reduction on typical sort of servicing rates by September. So we're watching closely based on the Transport for New South Wales data, and looking out to about 2036, we're expecting to see a 28% increase in the movement of freight across New South Wales as a whole. But for the Sydney area, the forecast is for about a 50% increase in freight. In terms of container increases, and I know that the statistics are not exactly the same from all the different sources, but Transport's predicting about a 77% increase in containers in Greater Sydney to 2036. So again, we're talking massive numbers in what isn't a huge amount of time in the scheme of things. And that's looking at about a 66% increase in household consumables. So that's largely driven by population growth, but not just by population growth. Those numbers are also driven by the significance of Sydney in supporting domestic markets and international markets. For me, that means that we have a huge challenge on our hands around thinking about getting the most efficiency that we can out of the networks that we currently have, and making sure that where we're spending money on capital investments, it's spending it in those areas where there are genuine constraints that can't be addressed through better fleet utilisation or can't be addressed through better network management. We have made some investments, or at least we're planning to make investments, and we're increasingly locking those in around the Western Sydney Freight Line and the Man Ray Road Industrial Precinct. The industry is also investing in intermodal terminals, which is very much aligned with state government strategy. But there needs to be more in order to accommodate that future growth.
As a major supplier and distributor of goods, in terms of the industry and where it's going and how it can improve, what are some of the things that are happening in your world?
Now, we saw during COVID, obviously, a huge spike in volumes, and we all know the toilet roll scenario. And I think, the supply chain, not just Woolies, but everyone had to adapt to that. And I think, with COVID, it continues to show us that we do have very agile supply chains, and we can react very quickly. But there is a limit to that. And I think, the way forward is only through collaboration on an industry basis with government, looking at infrastructure. We have set up certainly ancillary distribution centres to give us sufficient volume to meet significant spikes in demand. We've realigned our transport network to make sure that we got, again, the flexibility to do that. You would have seen from the press that there's been a huge spike in our online business. I think the future certainly is around how we use technology, because data is power. And again, doing that on a collaborative basis. What is the areas of population growth? Where are the bottlenecks? How can we use data in as real time as possible to actually give us the insights that we need to work together?
It's about partnerships between industry and with government. Is looking at how do we bring freight as close as we can to those centres as efficiently as we can. And that may mean bringing larger vehicles in closer to the centre, but we need to have the right end-of-trip facilities in order to be able to do that.
Is COVID making those challenges even more difficult, or are there changes that we should just be doing anyway?
Obviously, port supply chains are our ones that we manage are quite broad. We have fuel, we've got cement, we've got motor vehicles, but the one that gets the most discussed is containers. And the containers is linked very much to the consumers. So in terms of our market for New South Wales, of all of the full containers that are handled at Port Botany, 74% of those are imports, and only 26% are full exports. Freight has certainly not been a topic of key discussion in most forums, and in fact when you hear about planning and placemaking and planners talking about making places, how many times will you have heard freight mentioned in those discussions? And I can tell you almost never, because I'm sitting there raising freight, and our organisation raises freight. And yet, if you don't have the right freight systems, you actually can't then meet the needs of the people and the businesses. Some of the unusual things that happened in COVID that we haven't seen before, especially right at the start, is where we started to have different rules at state levels, across different states, and different rules between federal and state. And that was a real challenge because our port supply chains are global. And within Australia, they're national. And so as soon as you start to have different rules globally, domestically, you start to create issues. And once you impact on part of the supply chain, you actually have a cascading effect, and you impact throughout the supply chain. The government, certainly from a federal level, and I'll talk about national freight and supply chain strategy as well, they'd been working on this national freight and supply chain strategy and had delivered one before COVID came in, and were integrating that nationally with all of the different states. And what I'd say is I think that is even more important now. And people can recognise how much more important that is now and get on board. And what it probably does do, though, is it makes people look at that strategy and say, okay, what else do we need in this strategy? What wasn't in there that should be in there? And really, to me, the key focus is about adaptability, being able to have redundancy as well for these types of situations that you can't foresee, and having it not just across delivering infrastructure, but having it in the space of coordination, collaboration, data, as well as regulatory reform as well. And all of those pieces, I think there's an opportunity to deal with them now in a way that we may not have had the same buy-in as we had in the past, but I don't think the challenges or the problems are new. It's just that there's probably more awareness of them and maybe more appetite to do something about them.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting, and maybe to put a little bit of colour to that, I'm wondering, Paul, and maybe Susie, and I do want to come to you, Neil, as well, but what were some of, Paul, did you have some issues, particularly, state borders during COVID, and what were they, and how did you sort of try and navigate that? And I'm sure that there was some pressure on you, Susie, during those. But I'm just thinking it was real, some of those challenges. So are there some comments, thoughts there, Paul?
Yeah, there were. I mean, I think, it highlighted, COVID, our government structure, where the states do have legislative rights versus the Commonwealth, and certainly there are some areas where lessons were learned around how that coordination could be better achieved, and certainly getting drivers across borders or being able to move goods at a time when those drivers and everyone in the supply chain was under tremendous pressure. The pressure was added to because of some of the, I guess, bureaucratic confusion. But we did find a way around it. But again, I think, to Marika's point, let's not lose the momentum that COVID has brought for our agility. So if you look at the growth of online, online is accelerated probably 3 to 5 years from what it would have been without COVID.
Paul also talked about the curfews and how they were lifted during COVID, and they continue to be lifted. So this is about curfews that used to prevent delivery of goods to places outside of, in the evening hours and early morning hours, which have been lifted to allow that ongoing delivery. But that is the sort of thing that we need to remove permanently. Those types of constraints on efficiencies and productivities, they need to sort of be rethought. And rather than a default position of you can't do these things, it's under what circumstances can you do them? And Paul made the point about electric vehicles. Maybe that's something. What is the amenity outcome you need to achieve in order to do it? And then let industry work out how to do it.
Yeah, look, I think the time is right now to really start rethinking cities, mobility, freight, the whole lot, the whole shebang. And there's a few reasons for that. One is we have this amazing set of tools at our disposal. When we talk about data and analytics, that's all part of the tool set. We have also new imperatives. Like COVID is just a resilience imperative. It's a pretty nasty one, but we will have other resilience imperatives to face, as we have with bushfire season, things like that. We have sustainability, another imperative, and we want to keep the livability all happening. So that we have brand new imperatives that are really quite challenging for us. And we have the growth thing, so it's boom, it's a lot happening. And from a point of view of innovation, if you try to think of your city as, say, a giant app that you were trying to create this new app that was called a city, how would you go about it? You start with the customers and the stakeholders, trying to understand what a good user experience looks like in this city. And that includes how I get about, but it also includes getting my goods on time and how these things all interact together in a very positive way. We're asking more of our citizens because we know we can do better, more personalised services, but usually that involves giving up some privacy. And so there's a trade-off, and we'll face many more trade-offs as we go into this brave new world.
Have we got a system to get the data that we need to help us, create that sort of scenario of a city that people want?
I'm the data guy, and I say, don't focus too much on the data because it's a tool, right?
Yeah.
You don't want a tool-driven city.
Yeah.
You want a city driven by your vision and goals. Yeah. And data is part of the tool set. And you don't know exactly what tool set you want unless you have the vision, explicitly in your mind and agreed.
We largely have network data, and I think that's reflective of the organisation that we've come from compared to where we want to go. And we're in a process of being more strategically focused and working from there to identify, well, what customer information do we need, not just from the freight and supply chain industry, but from all customers about what outcomes they want from the movement of freight. How do we start to build our data sets or get access? We don't necessarily need to own it. How do we get access to and use information in a sensible way and do that in a way that is actually going to help us deliver improved outcomes as opposed to just looking to rake in information?
Just on the data, Catherine, there is actually a national freight data hub that is under development consideration at a federal level as part of the National Freight and Supply Chain Strategy, and I'm one of a number of people that are on an advisory group for that. The impetus for that was to come out of saying, okay, how do we actually quantify the benefits of infrastructure delivery? How do we identify what are some of the impediments to efficient freight deliveries and movements and the like? One of the challenges early on was identified as getting industry comfortable with providing data. So one of the early tasks is to get some small wins, get some information out there. But with COVID and with everyone moving to much more digital systems and industries being more open to sharing the information as a collaborative tool with governments to make sure that the supply chains can continue to operate. Again, I think we've got a really good opportunity in the here and now to get more buy-in for something that might have taken years to get that support. I think that's sort of been brought forward, and hopefully industry will all participate in this and see the value in collaborating data, not commercially sensitive information, aggregated, that then allows better decision making.
In my time in transport logistics, I've seen, and that is, I think people very readily set their minds to the physical world. We need a corridor, we need space for bigger trucks. But a big part of it is the process world, which is information and data and sequencing and communication. And, a successful delivery is someone meeting someone else at the right time at the right place so they can hand over the goods. So the information and the flow of information, the communication, gives you the power to start being more and more effective.
It's the first time that the movement of data has actually become more important than the physical movement of goods. Because if everybody builds in contingency. They build in contingency. Why? Because they don't have good data. If we can start building trust in the data, whether it be for that online delivery, and you can say to that customer, I will be there at 6:05, and that customer knows, because of the trust they have in the data over a period of the relationship, that it will be 6:05, then that ripples right the way back up to the source of supply. And we are going to have to look at how we readapt our existing infrastructure. We're a relatively young country compared to most. So whilst we have some laid down infrastructure, it's certainly not as challenging as some much older cities. Nonetheless, these challenges are large, and we need to take that much longer term vision that I think that we take today to really see that digital future that we're all embracing more so now than ever before.
I'm happy to go first. This might be a bit of a boring answer, but what I'd really, really like to be able to do, being government, is to make brave evidence-based decisions. And I know sort of education isn't the only answer, but have really credible information that says, we're going to try and work with you and get you comfortable with this, but we know that we are making the right decision, and being able to show some leadership in the decisions that we make about the movement of goods across the network.
I'll probably go with three key areas. So the easy one is, easy in the sense of it's known, it's tangible, is certain infrastructure priorities. And there's probably a shopping list of what are those priorities, and each sector will likely have their views around that. From the port's perspective, I think there's a couple of missing links that will need to be tied up. The second one I'd say is planning. And when I say planning, I think some of the things we've already touched on, like the curfews, removing caps, removing truck limits, those types of things, which should then be converted more to an outcomes-based condition. Number 3 would come down to, and I'll probably tread on some hot coals, industrial instruments. And I think the importance of making sure those instruments allow for adaptability and flexibility to cater for events such as COVID, to storm events, other climate change, all those things that will continue to be matters that need to be dealt with. And with that is also then an ability to have flexibility, adaptability, but redundancy in certain elements of the supply chain. So at the port end, for example, there are certain service providers where there's very few workers in those service provisions. Pilots is a really good example. There are 20 of them in Port Botany. They have to physically board a ship for those ships to arrive into the port. If you don't have a pilot on board a ship, you cannot bring that ship into the port. Now, in a situation like COVID, that presents a real risk, because if you have an outbreak amongst even half of those 20, then you automatically impact on your ability to bring in ships, which is a huge challenge. We've got a similar situation with other single service providers. So there needs to be more focus on how do you have plan B, and plan B doesn't have to be plan A, it's plan B for these events. And quite often the industrial instruments don't allow or make it very difficult to have a plan B. So I think it's a very good opportunity now to look at that.
I tend to agree with all the things that were said by Susie and Marika as well. Certainly rail for me is a no-brainer in this country. We're a big flat country, and the investment in rail for moving large volumes needs to be increased. I think the government's got to move away from talking about transport and infrastructure and saying we're going to build a road, we're going to build a new rail link. We've really got to think end to end. So if you take the Inland Rail, well, it in its own right is a great project. We still haven't figured out at the ends of that in Melbourne and Brisbane how we actually get it off the rail and into the communities that it's going to serve. So, it's not much good to me with stores in those areas and a DC that's not near the rail link. When I say that's great, I can get it to the end of the rail link, but I'm not sure where it's going to end. So we do need to think end to end. I think COVID, as you say, has brought transport and logistics to the forefront. How do we keep it there? How do we make sure it is a key pillar of our industrial growth? It's a huge contributor to GDP. We are trying to be, the smart nation. We are and are aware of how important exports are as well. And I think we've got to stop operating in pockets and really think end to end. And things, then simplification. We have some of our vehicles on our inbound to our DCs that will travel from Western Australia or Queensland. It will need 3 different or maybe 4 different permits by the time they get to the DC, which is crazy because of the state versus federal legislation. So for me, it's about really keeping supply chain end to end as a thought process at the cabinet level and at the state government levels. I think there's also education around town planners. How many councils have got a freight expert that sits in their town planning council? Not many that I've encountered. Certainly state governments have recognised that in recent years. So that's important as well. And then the third thing, as I say, is really looking at what is the most efficient movement of goods. And for me, it's rail, connecting them with our ports, connecting them with our distribution hubs, and then getting those products both out to consumers, but also allowing our export communities to bring them in efficiently to ports to get them back out to overseas markets.
Neil, were you going to add something now? Or?
Of course.
Yeah, of course. Go for it.
So I think there's still a design stage it's missing. It's a lot of vision that's implicit in what people are saying. They've got reasons for what they're doing, but I think we need to get better at engaging the customers and stakeholders, the citizens as well, in saying, here's the vision, and all these other decisions, our data collection and everything else is flowing from this vision. We need these curfews for this reason, and really get better at engaging our citizens and getting their buy-in to what we're trying to do. Those plans, those blueprints, those designs are more important than ever, because we're going to need it for sustainability, not just in energy, but in water and food and population, the whole lot. There's a whole lot of discussions we're not having that we need to have that are really critical discussions. And we don't want to be caught in the situation of asking people to have buy-in to things we've already kind of made the decision, and it's not tied very clearly to a bigger goal. So that's a really important step that I think we're still missing. We're still learning how to get that true deep customer focus. And whose responsibility? Well, we do need leadership from government. I think that we need a bit of leadership on that. Don't focus too much on the tools, guys. I know that's the big thing we're all keen on, but being clearer about and selling that vision for the future and what it's going to feel like for those future customers is more important right now, I think. So working on that. But I think it's also everyone's responsibility. I think it's unfair to pick on a particular group and say, look, you guys, you really let us down. You haven't done this or you haven't done that properly. There's a lot of great things happening, a lot of really good things happening. So that's exciting. But we all have a bit of a responsibility, I think, to lift our game and go for excellence, not just problem solving. We want to go for excellent experiences. What does that look like? That's our goal. Let's work backwards from there to what we want to do today. I don't know whether it still exists, but the Port of Valencia actually had a guarantee. They used to have this guarantee that when a ship, I think either a port came within sight of the port or something like that, that they would get the container, into the hinterland within whatever the time frame was, several days. And my response to that is, if the better you can manage your system, the better you can give guarantees. You take out the uncertainty as much as you can. And so if you want to be really good at doing supply chains, you want a situation where you've managed a lot of those uncertainty and variability. And so it's possible to do, but it's a bit, it's a community thing to achieve that.
That collaboration, that integration. And that's something I know, Marika, you've been talking about as well.
Yeah, I make the point. I think one of the things with COVID, though, is probably businesses re-looking at their supply chains and whether they need to perhaps have a more diverse supply chain to buffer any impacts that occur from either one region or one country. I think COVID sort of highlighted that, as it has done the just-in-time principle, which most businesses had moved to because the supply chains were deemed to be quite reliable and quite fast, and particularly air freight in that context. So I think there is and continues to be a bit of a rethink by businesses about how they deal with their supply chains globally and domestically, and that discussion will continue for a while. And it goes back, I guess, to Kirk's point about price doesn't guarantee you everything, so you need to think about that.
Yeah, Paul, I'm just thinking from a Woolworths perspective. How much wholesale remodeling of your supply chains, have you got an appetite for? Is it something you're always contemplating and hard to do, or it's a bit more steady as she goes?
We're always looking at what the future holds. We're doing a lot of work on big data and looking at predictive analytics and what that can tell us. And obviously we do a huge amount of work on consumer trends and what people are looking to buy. And we're continuing to increase the range of products that we sell in stores and online, and that presents new challenges. We've got a large drinks business, which is importing, whiskey from Scotland, for example, our Big W business, garments from Bangladesh. So we do have end-to-end supply chains. I think, to Marika's point, a number of suppliers have now identified during COVID that what was robust before COVID is not so robust during COVID. And, experiences where one tiny element of that product is made by a single source supplier that they can't get access to, and therefore the whole product doesn't get shipped. So we are looking at what COVID has meant to the resilience of our supply chains, the safety stocks that we hold, the safety stocks that our suppliers hold. And again, trying to use data to get some really good insights. But again, I think it's also pushed us to be even more collaborative with those suppliers. We talk about the famous toilet roll rush. We were able to work with one of our key suppliers to completely change their manufacturing around within 24 hours to cater for smaller pack sizes, so we could get at least something out to our customers during that panic time. So I think, using data, trying to foresee what the future holds, and again, back to Neil's point, always listening to the customer, because at the end of the day, they're the only ones that matter. We are changing the future of work, certainly for a lot of our people in our distribution centres as we look to automate. If we look at, we've introduced 2 full electric vehicles, trucks on the road into Australia. They've performed exceptionally well. Again, we go back to government regulation, no government incentives. In fact, it actually cost us more money to bring them in than it did if they were full diesel vehicles. And we need government to recognise the importance of that. But we are going to see more and more automation. Automation not just on the road, but in the suburbs, in the stores. We announced recently the opening of our latest what we call e-store, which is picking groceries through automation in the back of one of our supermarkets. So this is all going to accelerate very, very rapidly. We've seen what's happened in mobile phones from where we were 10 years ago to today. We're going to see the exact same thing in automation, both enhancing people's jobs as well as obviously, in some cases replacing people. So we're going to have to look at the future of work and how we retrain, our existing workforce who do some of those roles, and at the same time make sure we're investing in education so that we have robotics engineers, we have people who can really look at how we would design, manufacture, and put on the road electric vehicles. So I think all that again gets back to this collaboration aspect and working through government policy, private public investment in creating the right environments for industries to invest to create these new business models.
Yep. You're jumping, yeah. Neil's itching.
Always itching, but I don't want to. So just a quick point, and that is, it's interesting to note that on the process side and the information side that supports an efficient supply chain, which is a struggle right now, the communication between all those various parties doesn't work as well as you'd like to think it does, and there's a lot of paper involved and emails and all sorts of pretty crude technologies behind the scenes. But those things are being improved. But the point I wanted to make was a lot of that stuff is then future-proof. Once you've nailed good communication between the parties, however that occurs via centralised systems or distributed systems, doesn't really matter so much. But once you've nailed that and the standards, that's future-proof. It doesn't matter whether you're changing to AVs or EVs or whatever. So the nice bit about getting the process side working well is that it's worth investing in because it's future-proof. And then you're ready to roll with being more agile as you need to be and changing to different technologies.
I'll just comment on ports, Rico, as I know you were aware. Ports globally, I think, are have been early adopters of automation and technology. Back in 1993, I think, was the first terminal in Rotterdam to actually be automated or have automation. And in ports in Australia, we've got a number of what I call semi-automated terminals and an almost fully automated port terminal in Melbourne. So I think in ports there is that progressive move to automation. I think the points Paul made around the challenge is probably more in managing people and managing employees and managing governments and the expectations around what happens to people's jobs as associated with that. The reality is in the port space, the automation quite often makes the roles in the ports safer. They remove some of those jobs that are very manual and more risky. They also have a better impact for maintenance, lesser maintenance on the equipment because of the way that they're a little bit more consistently used rather than ramping up, ramping down and subject to different people's methods of operation. So I think it is about the nature of work in these industries will change. It's not going to replace people, it's going to replace certain roles. And similarly on the rail side, there'll be more automation in the rail terminals, both at the port and also at the intermodal ends as we go through. So I think there's got to be that constant conversation around automation isn't bad. Automation doesn't remove roles. Automation changes the types of roles. It puts more roles in technology and data and analysis and fewer roles sort of in the manual space and makes things safer. I think there's an opportunity. I mean, cars is a little problematic because of the fact that you've probably got to go through a transitional phase having shared use by public and freight. But there's probably an opportunity I see on dedicated freight rail lines. And that's an area I'm not convinced there's a lot of focus on. How do we take the next phase in those areas? I mean, it seems to me you do it in passenger rail where you have the light rail and other things where you don't have driverless trains. The freight rail system where we've got dedicated freight rail lines, certainly to and from Port Botany, is a really good opportunity to do some work in that space. I think, Rika, there needs to be more emphasis on some of those things. I'm just not sure they're at the top of people's priority list at the moment.
I think for government, what I see as being our role in terms of supporting industry to find efficiencies and innovations is to have a regulatory landscape that lets industry do that. I'd be really reluctant to say that government should step in and come up with the innovations, because I don't think we're in the right place to do that. Business is in the right place to do that, but we have to give you the platform. And part of doing that, this sort of goes to Marika's earlier comments about looking for outcomes-focused regulation, is having the confidence that you can then have the visibility and the information at the other end to see that the performance is what you were hoping for, and you can have that level of comfort then, whether it's automation or whether it's simply allowing more productive vehicles on certain roads, giving visibility to those that are responsible for the infrastructure or that are responsible for the outcomes of the network will help to kind of continue to build confidence around changing how those networks can be used.
I almost feel like we've reached a landing, which is we've got a window of opportunity to make some change, and there's a heightened awareness for all the wrong reasons, but it is what it is. So I'm going to put a panel question out there to each and every one of you, but maybe I'll start with you, Paul. What is the one thing that you think that could actually be the legacy? What is the one change that we should do now? That if the government said one thing, and I'll come to you at the end, maybe Susie, because are you going to take notes?
Only thinking time.
To really capture and leverage that opportunity, what Paul would be, top of your list?
I think for me it would be the agility we've all shown through COVID, the way that we've been able to work with government, local council, work with other stakeholders. How do we maintain that agility? How do we, a lot of barriers, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, a lot of formality was just thrown to the side, and everybody just focused on, okay, let's keep freight moving. How do we work with you to help you serve your customers? We've got to find a way of maintaining that. And I think that would be, the number one. I think, one of the fears I have is that, we'll get through this, as I'm sure we will, and then everything diverts back to status quo. So local councils will put back curfews. Government will start saying, well, we've got to look at permits now for heavy vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. We do have, I think, as Neil says, a window of opportunity here to maintain this agility and this new way of working. How do we find a way to do that and keep it pure to the focus, which is to create a more agile society, more productive society, and therefore allow us to build a better society as a result of that.
Thank you. Marika, how about you? What's on top of your list?
Very much aligned with that, which is maintaining the high level of recognition of the importance of freight. Because I think if that can be maintained, then I think all the decision making flows from that, and all those other pieces we've spoken about will naturally be delivered on and be addressed in some way, shape or form. But we've got to keep that awareness, because if the high priority associated with it diminishes, then we get relegated down into the sort of lower levels going forward. Yeah, exactly.
I agree. Neil?
I think we need to design the future we want, and we need to bring all the stakeholders along with those designs. And we probably need a bunch of blueprints, because there's going to be issues with every single one. But whatever that looks like, that's what I think is the key thing to achieve right now.
So Susie's written all of those down.
I'm going to be looking back at the recordings.
Yeah.
I like that point, and I think one of the opportunities of COVID is not just continuing with some of the improvements we've made, but using this as a bit of a whole point to think differently about what we might do in the future. So that's something I'm keen about. In terms of what we've learned from the experience so far, to Kirk's comments and really everyone's comments around getting equivalency around the movement of people and goods. And we've started to see that. I think I say it numerous times every day, but really driving that through, and not just from this is a transport problem, this is a community outcome that we want to achieve. And the other piece for me is getting much more nimble from a national perspective. So we talk about national harmonisation regularly. I think this has been a real test of what that actually means and looks like in practice, and we have some work to do on that front.
It's kind of interesting, and I'll finish on that note, but it's probably extremely appropriate that some of our forums coming up, we do have Shane Fitzsimmons, who's now head of Resilience New South Wales. I almost feel like we should ask him questions whether he's thought about freight. And likewise, coming up, we have Jeff Roberts from the GSC. So, the point made around integrating freight into the planning thinking, even is critical. And I just, it hasn't come up in the conversations I've had with planning for a long time. So those two up and coming forums, I'm going to pick up some of the useful information and throw a freight question to them. But thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, James, you and your team there at Moorebank. That is, as we said, an integral hub and an integral part. But you guys think bigger and broader than just what you do and how we make this system and this network really productive, sustainable, resilient. So I am extremely pleased to have our panel. So thank you, Paul, Marika, Neil and Susie. We're going to interview, if we haven't interviewed already, because Neil is leading the work that we're doing to have a thought leadership paper on freight, to really capture some of that blue sky thinking, to capture some of the window of opportunity and some of the things that we've talked about today. So you will hear and see more from Sydney Business Chamber on freight. Thanks again to everybody, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.